Today on Run It Back, we start reading Professor Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. Like most people, even those of us who went to college, I never had any education at all in socialism or Marxism or any kind of leftist thinking really at all. No matter what the right wing tells you, and Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk and Fox News, that doesn't really happen on campuses, even liberal universities like the one I went to. But nonetheless, as I've gotten older and problems have gotten worse in the country and in the world, and as I've faced real challenges in my own life, socialism has become something that I'm pretty interested in. I never thought I'd get there. I've owned businesses in the past, I still do today, and this thing I'm doing right here might eventually be a business too. It's not yet, but maybe one day. And I want those businesses, those dreams of owning businesses, people's idea of starting things to still exist and be compatible with socialism. And I think it is. So I recently started reading Understanding Socialism by Professor Richard Wolff. Now, I discovered Richard Wolff not super long ago, really. He's got a YouTube channel that's super boomer. It's a lot of fun. But then I saw him on Michael Brooks on TMBS, and he was fantastic. And then I started going back and watching some of his speeches and lectures and things like that. And he's incredible. And he really lays out the tenets of socialism in a way that's easy to digest and to understand and apply to life today. It's not super abstract. He gives you concrete examples of how things would be or should be or could be. Which is really the point, is imagining a new world. And so I started reading this book and decided, you know what, we should go section by section, and I should make videos on each section explaining what I learned and kind of follow my journey through understanding socialism. And hopefully I can finish up with a grasp on it and understand it. Before getting into too much detail, I wanted to lay out the three basic points Wolff makes in the introduction to understanding socialism. First, socialism is a product of capitalism. Second, there is no one set of rules for socialism. And third, that the main problem with implementing it today is that it's taboo. Socialism as a product of capitalism is super interesting to me. And it's not something I'd really ever thought of. I'd never thought that socialism, or the idea of it, had never existed until capitalism had already taken root. And thinking of that, I had never really considered that capitalism had ever taken root. It felt so natural that it's just the thing that we have. But no, capitalism really came to be with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution after that, where we broke away from feudalism. Which really sets up the kind of premise for his definition, for Wolff's definition of socialism, and his idea that socialism is just a product of capitalism, which is not really idea, it's just true, because that's when it developed. He says, by capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production, so how we produce things, in which the basic human relation is employer-employee, instead of master-slave or lord-serf, which is really interesting. Previously, our relationships with our bosses were lord-serf, whereas you're born and you have the freedom to do things, but you still pay taxes to whoever owns the land that you're born on. Before that, and after that for some people, unfortunately, was a master-slave relationship, like a king or something like that, or very direct rule where you just had to do what you were told to do. Wolff goes on to expand on that explanation on the next page when he provides his real critique of capitalism, really the basis of socialism. He says, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters, slaves, feudalism had lords and serfs, and monarchies had kings and subjects as the key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production in capitalism generated parallel problems. So he's not saying they're the same, but there are still issues related to the same freedoms and the same rights that the other systems had problems with. Wolff goes on, capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected, which is another really interesting way to think about the relationship that most workers have with their bosses. As a monarchy, we think again that it's so natural that, yeah, the boss, the person who owns the business, has all the say. We have to do exactly what they say or we have to go. We don't have, I guess, the ability to bargain, collective bargaining, if you will, unions. That's not natural or inherent in the system of capitalism. That came later. That was an add-on later, which was kind of a part of the whole socialist thing, is that socialism is a reaction to capitalism, which is really interesting. He goes on, or he says earlier too, which really just rang true to me, that capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty, which is really interesting to me because it's so true. We have the richest country ever here in the United States. You know, no country's ever had the money that we have, the billionaires that we have. But then we also have tons of people sleeping out on the street. We have kids who don't have health insurance. It's terrible. It's terrible. And the wealth inequality is only getting worse every single year. It gets worse and worse and worse. And there's not a whole lot being done about that, to change that, to reverse that. And I don't think there's going to be. Not without real progressive left-leaning leaders in office. The second point in Wolff's introduction to understanding socialism says that there's no one set of rules for socialism. It's constantly changing as it adjusts to the havoc brought on by capitalism. So as capitalism changes and grows and gets worse or finds new ways to hurt people, socialism has to adjust. Socialism can't stay static. So if anyone tells you socialism is exactly this, they are inherently wrong, because socialism changes every day the same way capitalism changes. Suddenly, socialists may have a different idea of what to do during a pandemic and what kind of resources need to be set aside beforehand and how to handle things, because now we've experienced that in a capitalist system. So I think that that's an important thing to understand about socialism. I don't know that that's his official second point in his intro, but it was the second thing I found interesting. There's one interesting quote from the book. It's about expecting imperfection. He says, transition from capitalism to one or another kind of socialism does not guarantee that all socialist goals will be achieved or that none will be abused. And then he gives a really good example. The abolition of slavery did not mean freedom was achieved and never subsequently abused, which is totally true. Sure, the United States got rid of slavery, but then we had Jim Crow laws and now our prison industrial complex, and things change more so than start and stop. Wolff's third point is that socialism is taboo, which is its main problem, and it's why it's really hard to pass any legislation that feels a little socialist. Americans are just afraid of it, and that's because of the last 50 years of both propaganda and kind of shitty versions of socialism. What Stalin did in Russia sucked. That's not good. Or in the USSR. China is not a kind of socialism people are comfortable with. So the examples we see aren't very good, whereas the ones that are good, we just pretend aren't socialism. Western Europe, the healthcare systems they have there, the national health system in Britain is as socialist as it gets. That's much more socialist than any kind of Medicare for all policy in the United States would be. One of the things he does in the book is not run away from those taboos. So I wanted to read this section too. It's important, and it's about the stains on movements, how socialism has stains, but so do all the other ones. And yeah, let's hear it. While the same indictment applies to Christianity or democracy or freedom, etc., that is not an excuse. Stalin and Pol Pot are stains on the history of socialism that it must account for and reject. The Spanish Inquisition, missionaries' misdeeds, holy wars against infidels, and countless wars among different interpretations are parallel stains on Christianity. Centuries of colonialism, the slave trade, world war, and mass poverty in the midst of great wealth stain capitalism. So that's an interesting take, saying that, we shouldn't run away from the past socialist attempts. And he doesn't even try to say, well, that wasn't real socialism. That wasn't real socialism. He doesn't make that argument here. He says, no, those were attempts and they were horrible attempts, and we should push back on those, and we should actively argue against them in some ways, I suppose he's saying. But he's also saying that every other thing, idea, movement has had not just bad actors and bad moments, but horrible periods of history. Capitalism is responsible for slavery. They're hand in hand. So I think it's important that he makes that point. I would have been sitting here thinking, okay, so what about X number of people that died in the USSR, or, whatever. At the end of the introduction, Wolff talks about how socialism is taboo and we need to overcome that. And he has this great quote that really sums up not just that it's taboo, but that we need to accept the real history and be able to talk about it. He says, across nearly all their different streams and interpretations, recognize that the tradition benefits as much from acknowledging abusive usages of socialism, not to be repeated, as from celebrating and building successful usages, which is important. And it's a really honest interpretation of socialism, and it's an honest attempt at building a system in America that's better than our current capitalist system, which creates so much inequality. He's saying that when we fail, we can't do like how centrists do and just like move on, we'll just keep doing it the same old way. We need to recognize failures. We can't keep doing that. No, you're not allowed to bash Obama, he did nothing wrong, we're just going to keep on going. No, we have to recognize what didn't work, and we need to adjust. So far, this book has been really interesting. I've only gotten through the introduction, but Wolff has been really honest so far in his explanation, and he's a great communicator, and he makes it very clear what he's talking about. Again, the main points in the intro: socialism is a product of capitalism. There's no one set of rules, and it's always changing because capitalism is always changing. And the main problem with getting socialist legislation today is that it's taboo. I really look forward to continuing reading the book, getting into the next chapters, and seeing how we can overcome some of those taboos and how we can start maybe implementing some of these socialist policies. For now, that's all I have though, and I hope you will join us next time on Run It Back. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this.